Gary Heidnik lived at 3520 North Marshall Street. In March 1987, neighbors hadn't heard from or seen Gary in over a week and grew concerned. But their concern soon turned to horror when the home was raided by law enforcement. There, in Gary's basement, were 6 women kidnapped, brutally assaulted, and chained up. Yet that wasn't the worst of it. Gary was known to be eccentric, yet seen as an innocuous figure, even holding church services in his Philadelphia home. But the truth was, Gary was a monster who would go on to inspire works of fiction beyond even his greatest nightmares. Gary Heidnik's early life was marked by a troubled childhood, one in which he claimed his father had mercilessly abused him and mocked his bedwetting. These early traumas set the stage for a life of isolation and stunted social development. Despite his struggles, Heidnik managed to join the army after high school, only to be discharged after a mere 13 months due to mental health issues, specifically schizoid personality disorder. This would be the first of many red flags that pointed to the disturbed individual lurking beneath the surface. Undeterred by his setbacks, Heidnik found a new avenue to exert control over others through religion. In 1971, he started the United Church of the Ministers of God in Philadelphia with a modest investment of $1,500 and just 5 followers. However, his charisma and manipulative tactics allowed him to grow his cult substantially, amassing over $500,000 for his twisted cause. It was through this religious facade that Heidnik honed his skills in manipulating people, a talent he would later employ to devastating effect on the women he kept locked up in his basement. Heidnik's criminal history was peppered with charges related to sexual assault, yet he managed to evade serving any significant time for his offenses. He even faced accusations of spousal rape from his Filipino mail-order bride, Betty Disto, whom he had wed in 1985 and fathered a son with before she left him in 1986. 2 other women also bore his children and complained of his deviant sexual practices and propensity for locking them up. In 1978, he faced his first imprisonment after abducting the sister, Alberta Davidson, of his then-girlfriend, Anjanette Davidson, from the Harrisburg State Hospital. Heidnik claimed it was on day leave, but he would then proceed to imprison Alberta in a locked storage room in his basement. After 10 excruciating days, she was found chained up by law enforcement and returned to the hospital where she was examined. It was upon examination that doctors realized Heidnik had raped and sodomized her and infected her with gonorrhea. He was arrested and convicted of kidnapping, rape, unlawful restraint, false imprisonment, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, and interfering with the custody of a committed person. However, due to his mental health issues, he was held for 3 years in mental institutions before being released in April 1983. These disturbing patterns were a precursor to the horrors that would unfold in his basement, where he would kidnap 6 black women to rape and torture. The first known victim of Heidnik's depravity was Josefina Rivera, captured in 1986. Rivera was a sex worker, and Heidnik offered her $20 for her services. She agreed, as he seemed presentable. She went back with him to his home where the pair had sex, but it would only be after the act that Heidnik would enforce his brutal plan. Heidnik choked her from behind and dragged her down to his basement, where he shackled her limbs together with chains and sealed the bolts with super glue. Rivera's life flashed before her eyes as she was beaten with a stick until her screams for help were silenced. Thrown into a pit and sealed in with only thin cracks of light seeping through, Rivera's ordeal was just beginning. Each day, Heidnik would come down to assault Rivera, and the hole he had placed her in would gradually grow bigger as he shoveled dirt and gave her insight into his horrific plans to create his own family by impregnating her and other women. Over 3 months, Heidnik would kidnap 5 more women, all in the same manner as Rivera. His victims were all black, as Heidnik's lawyer would later reveal that he was trying to enslave 10 black girls to have babies with and create a perfect race. The women were subjected to unimaginable horrors, choked, chained up, and thrown into the pit, only to be pulled out for rape and torture. Heidnik would turn on the radio at full blast to prevent their screams from being heard. Alternatively, he would beat them until they passed out. At other times, to prevent any thoughts of escape, he would push screwdrivers into the women's ears. Heidnik would routinely rape the women, working his way through them. When he felt too tired to continue, he would force them to perform sexual acts on each other, often painful and without consent. As time passed, a disturbing dynamic dynamic emerged within the confines of the basement. Rivera, in a twisted form of Stockholm syndrome, began to convince Heidnik that she was on his side. He appointed her as the boss of the other women, pitting them against each other in a sick game of control. Rivera's privileged position came at a cost. She had to aid in the torture of the other women, or risk losing her meager comforts. In one particularly harrowing incident, Heidnik forced Rivera to fill the pit with water, attach a stripped extension cord to the other women's chains, and electrocute them while he watched. The shock was so intense that one of the women, Deborah Dudley, was electrocuted to death. The horrors continued to escalate, with Heidnik barely reacting to Dudley's death, coldly stating, "Yeah, she's dead. Now I can get back to having a peaceful basement." Another victim, Sandra Lindsay, a mentally disabled woman whom Heidnik had met when he was institutionalized, met a similarly gruesome fate. Starved to death for days after failing to endure the abuse, Lindsay's body was dismembered by Heidnik, who cooked her ribs in the oven and boiled her head on the stove. The smell of her flesh cooking prompted neighbors to call the police, but Heidnik managed to evade suspicion by claiming he had merely burned a roast. In a twisted act of cannibalism, Heidnik ground up Lindsay's flesh, mixed it with dog food, and forced the other women to eat it. The survivors, faced with the horrifying choice of cannibalizing their dead friend or starving to death, had no choice but to comply. The trauma of this act would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Amidst the unimaginable horrors, a glimmer of hope emerged in the form of Josefina Rivera's cunning. Heidnik had begun using her as bait to lure more women into his clutches, allowing her brief trips outside while keeping her under close watch. On March 24, 1987, Rivera seized her chance and convinced Heidnik to let her visit her family for a few minutes, agreeing to meet him at a nearby gas station afterward. As soon as she was out of his sight, Rivera rushed to a phone and called 911, setting in motion the events that would finally bring an end to the House of Horrors. The police swiftly arrested Heidnik at the gas station and raided his home, freeing the women who had endured months of unimaginable torture. Despite Rivera's crucial role in their rescue, the other victims were initially furious with her, angry at the part she had played in their suffering. However, in the end, Rivera was recognized as a victim herself, and Heidnik was forced to face the consequences of his actions in court. Gary Heidnik's trial was a media sensation, with his attempts to plead insanity ultimately failing. He was convicted in July 1988 and sentenced to death. Despite his efforts to take his own life in prison and his family's attempts to have his sentence commuted, Heidnik was executed by lethal injection on July 6, 1999. The impact of Heidnik's crimes extended far beyond the courtroom, with his story serving as the inspiration for the character of Buffalo Bill in the iconic film The Silence of the Lambs. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Heidnik's legacy was the continued devotion of his cult members, even after his arrest. Every Sunday, as news channels broadcast the horrific details of his crimes, his followers would still gather in his house for services. The fact that these individuals, described by neighbors as poor and black, remained under Heidnik's spell, even as the truth of his actions came to light, serves as a chilling testament to his manipulative powers. Reportedly, Heidnik even managed to enlist one of his congregants, a mentally disabled man named Tony Brown, to partake in the torture. The case of Gary Heidnik, the real-life Buffalo Bill killer, stands as a horrifying reminder of the depths of human depravity and the power of manipulation. His victims, both those he held captive in his basement and those he controlled through his cult, serve as a tragic testament to the long-lasting impact of his crimes.